He never imagined that a quiet morning at Lincoln Central High would expose a criminal empire that had terrorized 5 states. The Thunderwolves, the most feared motorcycle gang on the East Coast, thought they were just destroying another old man's van when they targeted the school's humble janitor. As they gleefully smashed up his most precious possession, they had no idea they were about to provoke a legendary FBI agent whose final case had brought down the largest weapons trafficking ring in U.S. history. What these dangerous men didn't know, what nobody in town knew, was that Robert Anderson wasn't just a simple maintenance worker. Behind his patient demeanor and worn work boots lay one of the Bureau's most decorated agents, a man whose undercover operations had put 3 criminal organizations behind bars and dismantled 2 international smuggling rings. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gentle swoosh of Bob Anderson's push broom created perfect patterns across the deserted parking lot of Lincoln Central High School. The autumn sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt where he'd spent the last 3 years maintaining his cover. At 61, his weathered face and slightly stooped shoulders made him invisible to the students and staff who passed by, exactly as he'd been trained to be during his decades with the Bureau. His old Dodge van, faded blue and battle-worn, sat in its usual spot near the maintenance entrance. Each dent and scratch told a story of his life with Sarah, his late wife who'd helped him restore it during their final years together. The van wasn't just a vehicle, it was his last connection to her, filled with photos and memories they'd shared before cancer took her 2 years ago. Their weekend trips to the coast, the camping adventures in the mountains, the quiet moments watching sunsets from the back doors, every memory preserved within its metal frame. The distant thunder of motorcycles shattered the morning peace. Bob's trained ears picked up the distinct sound signatures, 6 bikes, heavily modified for maximum intimidation, approaching from the east entrance. He continued his methodical sweeping, but his mind shifted into a familiar gear, one honed by decades of undercover work. 3 years of maintaining his cover as head janitor had taught him every corner of this parking lot, every sight line, every potential point of vulnerability. Through the security office window, Kevin Phillips watched the approaching bikers with growing concern, their leather cuts marking them as members of the Thunderwolves. "Mr. Anderson," he called over the radio, "we've got company." Young Kevin had only been working security at Lincoln Central for 6 months, but he'd already learned to trust the old janitor's judgment in tense situations. The motorcycles roared into the parking lot, their chrome gleaming menacingly in the early morning light. Nathan "Ghost" Parker cut his engine first, the sudden silence more threatening than the thundering bikes that preceded it. His reputation for ruthless expansion had earned him both his nickname and control over the Thunderwolves' operations in 3 counties. The gang had been pushing their way into local businesses, offering protection that couldn't be refused, and now they'd set their sights on the school. "Well, well," Ghost's voice carried across the empty lot. "Looks like someone's up early." Bob maintained his steady, sweeping rhythm, each movement carefully measured through years of practicing patience. Through his peripheral vision, he watched the bikers spread out in a practiced formation. Brick Johnson took position on the right while Viper Hawkins moved to the left. The remaining 3 bikers created a loose semicircle, a tactical pattern Bob recognized from countless operations during his Bureau days. Principal Helen Watson had warned him about the gang's recent activities in the area. 3 local businesses had already given in to their demands for protection money, and 2 others had their windows mysteriously smashed when they refused. Now they were targeting schools, trying to establish security contracts that were nothing more than thinly veiled extortion. Through the school's security cameras, Kevin watched with growing alarm as the bikers encircled Bob in his van. His hand hovered over the phone, ready to call the police, but something about the old janitor's calm demeanor made him hesitate. He'd seen that same steady composure last month when Bob had talked down 3 armed teenagers who'd tried to break into the school after hours. "School's got cameras," Bob warned, nodding toward the visible security system. "Might want to think carefully about your next move." Ghost's smile widened as he swung the chain experimentally. "Cameras break, records get lost, accidents happen. He pressed closer, using his height to loom over Bob. "Question is, old man, do you want to be one of those accidents?" Bob watched their reflections in his van's dusty windows, noting how Brick's hand kept straying toward his jacket pocket, the bulge suggesting a .45, poorly concealed. Viper's stance indicated a knife, probably in his boot. The other three carried various improvised weapons, visible in the way they carried their weight. 25 years of undercover work had taught him to read the subtle signs of concealed weapons, and these men were practically broadcasting their intentions. Kevin's whispered voice came through Bob's concealed radio. "Police are 10 minutes out." Too long, Bob thought. Whatever was about to happen would be over, one way or another, in less than 2. He made a show of leaning on his broom, shoulders slumping in apparent resignation, but his mind was already shifting into the state of heightened awareness he'd known so well during his years with the Bureau. Some things you never forget, and handling dangerous people who think they found an easy mark was a skill that had kept him alive through countless operations. "Look," Bob said, letting a practiced tremor enter his voice. "I don't want any trouble. Just starting my morning rounds. Students will be here soon." Ghost glanced at the photos visible through the van's window, snapshots of a younger Bob and Sarah at various locations, memories frozen in time. With a sudden movement, he slammed his chain against the van's side panel, leaving a deep gash in the faded blue paint. The sound echoed across the parking lot like a gunshot. "Students ain't here yet, old man," Ghost sneered, watching for Bob's reaction. "Nobody here to see what happens next. Last chance to walk away while your van's only got one scratch." Bob felt something shift inside him as he watched the metal links mar the panel he and Sarah had carefully restored together. His grip on the broom handle tightened imperceptibly, muscle memory from countless operations taking over. But 25 years of undercover work had taught him the value of patience. "That van," Bob's voice remained steady, though he let it sound strained. "It belonged to my wife. She's gone now. Please, just leave it be." Ghost's laugh carried genuine cruelty. "Gone, huh? Well, maybe you'll see her soon." He nodded to his men. "Show Grandpa here what happens when people don't appreciate our protection services." Brick and Viper moved toward the van, their boots scraping against the asphalt with predatory confidence. The other 3 bikers spread out wider, cutting off potential escape routes with practiced efficiency. Through the security office window, Kevin watched in horror as they began their assault on the vehicle. The first swing of Brick's crowbar shattered the passenger window, sending glass cascading over Sarah's favorite dashboard ornament, a small crystal hummingbird that caught the morning light. Viper's steel-toed boot left a deep dent in the driver's side door, right through the spot where Bob and Sarah had carefully touched up the paint last summer. "Stop," Bob said quietly, but the tremor in his voice was gone now. Something in his tone made Ghost pause, years of street instinct warning him that something wasn't quite right. But his reputation was on the line. He couldn't back down in front of his crew. "You hearing this?" Ghost called out to his men. "Old-timers giving orders now." He swung his chain again, this time catching the van's side mirror, ripping it clean off. Guess he needs a closer look at what happens to people who don't show proper respect. Through his radio, Kevin's voice came urgent. "Mr. Anderson, police are still 8 minutes out. Should I trigger the emergency lockdown?" Bob didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on a photo that had fallen from the broken window. Him and Sarah on their last camping trip, her smile still radiant despite the illness that would take her just weeks later. One of the bikers crushed it under his boot with deliberate malice. 25 years, Bob said, his voice carrying a new quality that made several of the bikers exchange uncertain glances. 25 years in the Bureau, and you know what I learned? He straightened up, his shoulders losing their stoop, hands shifting their grip on the broom handle with professional precision. Some people just can't read on the warning signs. Ghost's smile faltered slightly. Bureau? What are you talking about, old man? FBI, Bob clarified, his stance subtly shifting. Organized Crime Division. Retired now, of course. But you know what they say about muscle memory. His eyes, no longer those of a tired janitor, scanned each biker with tactical assessment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's right. Shadow's trying the same play again, isn't he? Using gang chapters to pressure schools into accepting security contracts, creating cover for moving merchandise through supposedly secure locations. The approaching bikes were close now, their engines echoing off the school buildings. But Bob's next words froze Ghost in place. "What's in the old auto shop storage room, Ghost?" "The one Shadow told you to make sure was included in your protection contract. Because I've got to tell you, the Bureau's forensics team is going to be very interested in comparing those serial numbers to the list from last month's hijacked shipment." "You're bluffing," Ghost said, but his voice lacked conviction. "There's no way you could know, about the weapons," Bob finished for him, "or about Shadow's deal with the hijackers. Amazing what you can learn when people think you're just the janitor who cleans their meeting spaces. 3 years is a long time to gather evidence, document connections, build an airtight case." The new arrivals roared into the parking lot. 8 bikes, their riders wearing the same colors but with patches indicating higher rank in the organization. But instead of finding a beaten old man and a destroyed van, they were confronted with 6 increasingly uncertain gang members being held at bay by a former federal agent who seemed almost pleased by their arrival. "Perfect timing," Bob commented loud enough for the newcomers to hear. "Kevin, please tell me the surveillance team got all that on camera, especially the part about the auto shop storage?" "Every word, Mr. Anderson," Kevin replied, his voice carrying clearly through the radio. "State Police Tactical Unit says they're 2 minutes out. FBI response team right behind them." One of the new arrivals, a heavily scarred man Bob recognized from surveillance photos as Shadow's second-in-command, dismounted his bike slowly. "Ghost," he called out, his voice carrying authority that made the younger gang leader stiffen. "What exactly did you tell this Fed about our operations?" "Nothing," Ghost protested quickly. Too quickly. "He's just some old man playing mind games. There's nothing in that storage room." "Interesting choice of words," Bob noted calmly. "I don't recall mentioning which storage room. But since you brought it up, want to explain why your chapter needed 3 separate sets of keys made last week? Or why there's been after-hours traffic through the service entrance every night since the weapons shipment disappeared?" The second-in-command's face darkened. "Ghost, you idiot. You let a Fed play you into confirming an active operation? Shadow's going to have your head for this." "That's assuming Shadow still has any authority to take heads," Bob commented mildly, his stance subtly adjusting to account for the new arrivals. "Right about now, his warehouse district operation should be getting some unexpected visitors. Turns out when you spend 3 years watching a school, you notice all sorts of interesting patterns, like how certain vehicles always take the same route between here and those warehouses." The second-in-command's hand moved toward his jacket, but Bob's warning came swift and clear. "I wouldn't. Unlike your younger associates here, you've got enough experience to know what happens next if you draw that weapon. 25 years in the Bureau teaches you how to handle situations like this. Want to guess how many of them ended well for people who tried to escalate?" Through the radio, Kevin's voice carried new urgency. "Mr. Anderson, State Police Tactical Unit just reported in. They've secured the warehouse district, multiple arrests in progress, including..." He paused for effect. "Shadow himself." The impact of this news rippled through both groups of bikers. The newer arrivals exchanged alarmed glances, while Ghost and his crew seemed to deflate, realizing they'd stumbled into something much bigger than a simple intimidation job. The morning sun now fully illuminated the parking lot, casting harsh light on their increasingly desperate situation. 3 years, Bob continued, the broom handle moving in small, controlled patterns that kept everyone at a respectful distance. 3 years of watching Shadow rebuild the same operation that got shut down 15 years ago. Same patterns, same methods, just a different set of schools. Did he really think no one would notice? Or did he get so comfortable in his power that he forgot the basic rule of criminal enterprises? The bigger you build it, the harder it falls? The second-in-command's face showed the calculation of a man seeing his options rapidly disappear. "You're bluffing about Shadow. There's no way a retired Fed working as a janitor could set up an operation this big. This is some kind of trick, has to be." "Martin Scarface Delaney," Bob replied, using the man's real name. "Served 8 years for armed robbery before joining the Thunderwolves. Rose through the ranks by handling Shadow's more delicate problems. Like what happened to that witness in the Carson case last year." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Amazing what you can learn when you maintain your old bureau contacts. Even more amazing what they can do with that information. By the way, how's your brother Tommy doing? Still running those protection rackets in Baltimore? Or did he finally take that plea deal the FBI offered last month?" Delaney's face went pale at the mention of his brother, a connection that was supposed to be completely hidden. The other bikers shifted uneasily, realizing just how deeply their organization had been compromised. The distant sound of sirens began to grow louder. Through the security office window, Kevin watched as multiple police vehicles approached from different directions. A coordinated response that had clearly been planned well in advance. The tactical teams had timed their approach perfectly, using the school's morning traffic patterns to mask their movements. "Here's what happens next," Bob announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd orchestrated this moment for years. "Those sirens? That's 3 tactical units converging on this location. Behind them are FBI evidence response teams. They're not just here for you. They're here for what's in that storage room. And thanks to Ghost's helpful confirmation of an active operation, they've got probable cause for a search." Ghost's face showed the dawning horror of someone realizing they'd been masterfully played. "You set this up, all of it, the van, the photos playing the grieving widower. It was all some kind of elaborate trap." "Sarah was real," Bob cut him off, his voice carrying a sharp edge for the first time. "Everything about her was real. She helped me restore that van you just vandalized during her last year of life. She knew what I was doing here, why I chose this place for retirement. Her last words to me were about finishing what we started, making sure places like this school stayed safe from people like you. But you're right about one thing. I knew someone would eventually target the school. Criminals like Shadow are predictable that way. They always return to what they think worked before." The second-in-command made a subtle gesture, and several of the new arrivals began moving toward their bikes. Bob's next words stopped them cold. "Those serial numbers in the storage room? They match a hijacked military shipment from last month. That makes this federal jurisdiction. You really want to add fleeing from federal officers to the charges? Because I've got to tell you, the Bureau takes a dim view of people who steal military hardware." Through his radio, Kevin reported with barely contained excitement. "First tactical unit in position, Mr. Anderson. They're setting up a perimeter. FBI teams right behind them. SWAT's moving to secure the auto shop storage area." "Last chance," Bob announced, loud enough for all to hear. "Surrender now. We keep this simple. Weapons charges, racketeering, the usual. Resist?" He shrugged. "Well, I may be retired, but I've still got to file reports. Would hate to add assaulting a federal officer to the paperwork. Then again, might be worth it just to show these young ones how we handled things in the old days." The parking lot fell silent except for the growing wail of sirens. The bikers looked to their more experienced members for guidance, but found only uncertainty. They'd come expecting to support an intimidation operation against a school janitor. Instead, they'd walked into the endgame of a 3-year federal investigation. The second-in-command broke the silence. If Shadow's really been arrested, if the warehouse district is compromised, then your entire organization is being rolled up as we speak, Bob finished for him. Every safe house, every storage location, every corrupt contact Shadow cultivated. 3 years of evidence gathering tends to be pretty thorough. Should have looked closer at the janitor with the spotless record and convenient backstory. But then again, that's always been the fatal flaw in operations like yours. Underestimating the people you think are beneath you. The sound of screeching tires announced the arrival of the first tactical unit. Black SUVs and police cruisers poured into the parking lot, their lights painting the morning scene in strobes of red and blue. Bob maintained his position, the broom handle still moving in those small, controlled patterns that had kept the bikers at bay. "Right on time," he commented, watching the coordinated deployment of tactical teams. "You know what impresses me most about modern law enforcement? The response times. Back in my day, we had to maintain our covers for hours sometimes, waiting for backup. Now?" He gestured at the rapidly forming perimeter. "Almost makes the job too easy." Ghost, his earlier bravado completely evaporated, watched as heavily armed officers took up positions around them. This whole time, 3 years, you were just waiting? "Not just waiting," Bob corrected, his stance relaxing slightly as the tactical teams moved in. "Building a case, documenting connections, following money trails. You'd be amazed what people say around a janitor. They see the uniform, the work boots, the cleaning cart, and their brains just filter you out. Like you're part of the furniture." The second in command, Delaney, kept his hands carefully visible as the tactical team approached. "The auto shop program. Shadow's insistence on having our people teach there." "Perfect cover for moving weapons through school property," Bob finished for him. "Same play he tried 15 years ago. Only back then he was smart enough to use intermediaries. This time?" He shook his head. "Getting personally involved, using his own gang members as instructors? Sloppy. The kind of mistake people make when they think they're untouchable." Detective James Cooper emerged from one of the tactical vehicles, his face showing the satisfaction of a long-planned operation coming together. "Mr. Anderson," he called out, approaching with practiced caution. "Warehouse team reports complete success. Shadow and his top lieutenants are in custody. They found the entire weapons shipment, plus evidence linking it to 3 other hijackings." "And the documentation?" Bob asked, still keeping the bikers in his peripheral vision. "Right where you said it would be. Shadow kept records of everything. Shipments, payoffs, distribution networks. FBI's already matching serial numbers to stolen military hardware from across 6 states. The younger bikers shifted uneasily as more police units arrived. Through his radio, Kevin provided a running commentary of the perimeter setup, his security training evident in his precise observations. "SWAT team accessing the auto shop storage now, Mr. Anderson. They're reporting. Yes, confirmation on the weapons cache. Matches the list from last month's hijacking." Ghost's face showed the dawning comprehension of someone seeing their entire world unravel. "The security cameras you installed last year. The new surveillance system. All feeding directly to federal servers," Bob confirmed. "Every meeting in that auto shop, every late-night delivery, every conversation about special shipments, all documented and time-stamped. You really should pay more attention to who handles your security installations." Delaney, his years of criminal experience letting him see the full picture, spoke up. "The maintenance company that services our properties and the one Shadow insisted we use. Harrison Security Services?" Bob smiled slightly. "Interesting coincidence that they got those contracts right after I retired, isn't it? Amazing how many places a maintenance crew can access without raising suspicion, especially when the client is so careful about keeping their legitimate businesses separate from their illegal operations." More FBI vehicles arrived, these carrying evidence response teams. Bob watched as they began setting up their equipment with practiced efficiency. "You know what your biggest mistake was?" He addressed the gathered bikers. "Not the weapons, not the school connection, not even the sloppy operational security. It was thinking that someone like me would actually retire." "You did retire," one of the younger bikers protested. "Everyone knows you left the Bureau 3 years ago." "Left active duty," Bob corrected. "But some cases, some missions, they're too important to fully walk away from. Protecting schools, keeping weapons off the streets, making sure gangs like yours can't intimidate communities. That's not just a job, it's a calling." Detective Cooper approached with handcuffs ready. "Mr. Anderson, we're ready to begin processing them. Any specific order you'd prefer? Bob's eyes locked onto Ghost. Start with our friend who thought vandalizing my van was a good idea. I want him to have plenty of time to think about how this all started, with a simple decision to target what he thought was an easy mark. As the tactical teams began securing the bikers, Bob finally lowered his broom handle. Through the school's entrance, he could see Principal Watson arriving, her face showing concern mixed with relief. The morning sun now fully illuminated the parking lot, revealing the damage to his van, each dent and scratch a testament to the violence that had nearly erupted. Kevin, he spoke into his radio, make sure the evidence teams get clear footage of the van damage. We'll be adding vandalism and attempted intimidation to the weapons charges. Already done, Mr. Anderson, Kevin replied, his voice carrying new respect. Like riding a bike, isn't it, boys? For a moment, the only sound was the gentle morning breeze rustling through the trees. Then Ghost's laugh shattered the silence, but it carried a nervous edge now. You expect us to believe that? A Fed-playing janitor? No, Bob replied calmly. I expect you to look at my van's license plate, the one you just bent. Run those numbers through whatever contacts you've got in the DMV. I'll wait. One of the younger bikers already had his phone out, fingers moving quickly. His face suddenly went pale. Ghost, he's not lying. That plate, it's registered to a retired federal agent, Special Division. The funny thing about undercover work, Bob continued conversationally, though his eyes tracked every subtle movement of the increasingly unsettled bikers, is that you learn to spot the signs, like how your friend there keeps his piece in his right pocket but favors his left hand, or how your knife guy's stance telegraphs every move he's planning. Ghost's face darkened with rage, but uncertainty had crept into his expression. 6 of us, one of you, Fed. Those odds don't look good, no matter what fancy training you had. Bob's smile carried decades of experience facing down much worse odds. Want to know another funny thing about retirement? Gives you time to stay in practice, and I've had 3 years to turn every inch of this parking lot into home field advantage. Ghost's hand tightened on his chain as he processed this new information. You know what? Doesn't matter who you used to be. Way I see it, we've still got ourselves a simple situation. 1 old man, 6 of us, and no witnesses except a security guard kid too scared to leave his office. About that, Bob said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. Kevin, remember that protocol we discussed? Through the radio came Kevin's steady reply. Already done, Mr. Anderson. All cameras recording to the secure server. Live feed going to the state police and FBI field office. They're watching everything. Bob watched the subtle shifts in the bikers' postures, the slight widening of stances, the hands straying closer to weapons, the quick glances between members looking for guidance. 3 years of maintaining his cover as head janitor had taught him to read people just as well as he had during his FBI days. Here's what's about to happen, Bob continued, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made him legendary in the Bureau's undercover division. You've got about 2 minutes to make a choice. You can leave now. We'll call this morning's property damage a misunderstanding. Or, he adjusted his grip on the broom handle with practiced precision, we can explore why my last case before retirement involved teaching hand-to-hand combat at Quantico. You're bluffing? Brick growled, though his hand had stopped straying toward his concealed weapon. No Fed would spend 3 years playing janitor at some high school. Unless, Bob replied, he wanted a quiet place to retire, somewhere to honor his wife's memory, a place where he could keep doing what he'd always done, protecting people who can't protect themselves. His eyes locked onto Ghost's. And maybe, just maybe, he knew someday someone would be stupid enough to target a school. Ghost's face twisted with rage. Nobody calls me stupid, old man, especially not some washed-up Fed playing custodian. He swung the chain in a wide arc, its links whistling through the morning air. Bob's movement was so subtle, so efficient, that several of the bikers initially missed what happened. One moment, Ghost's chain was slicing toward him. The next, the broom handle had intercepted it perfectly, the chain wrapping around the wooden shaft. A simple twist of Bob's wrists, a technique he'd perfected decades ago, and the chain was no longer in Ghost's control. "First mistake," Bob said, calmly, letting the chain unwind to the ground. "Telegraphing your attack. We can do this all morning, but fair warning. I've had 3 years to practice with this broom handle. Made some interesting modifications, too." Viper moved first, his knife appearing in his hand with practiced speed. But Bob had already noted his tendency to lead with his right shoulder, a tell that had gotten many street fighters in trouble. The broom handle moved in a fluid arc, catching the enforcer's wrist at precisely the right angle. The knife clattered across the parking lot, sliding under a parked car. "Second mistake," Bob continued, his stance relaxed but ready. "Assuming age slows you down. Want to know what really happens? You get smarter, more efficient. You learn to read situations, to spot the weaknesses that young hotheads don't even know they're showing." Through the security office window, Kevin watched in amazement as his seemingly unassuming colleague moved with the fluid grace of a much younger man. Every motion was precise, economical, born of years of experience in situations far more dangerous than this. Brick and 2 others moved to flank Bob, thinking to use their numbers as an advantage. But the old agent simply backed up, positioning himself so the rising sun would be in their eyes. Another lesson learned from countless operations. Use the environment. Make every external factor work in your favor. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Bob said, his voice still carrying that calm authority. "Those cameras are recording everything. State police have your faces, your colors, your bike registrations, and in about 5 minutes, they'll have you in custody. The only question is what condition you'll be in when they arrive." Ghost, his earlier confidence cracking, spat on the ground. "You think some security footage scares us? Records disappear. Witnesses change their stories. That's how things work in the real world, Fed." "Interesting theory," Bob replied. "Want to test it against 25 years of building airtight cases? Because I've got to tell you, Ghost, you're not even in the top 10 of intimidating criminals I've put away. Remember the Richmond case in '98? The one that took down 3 trafficking rings and 2 corrupt police precincts? That was me. Spent 2 years as a dock worker, learning every detail, building the case piece by piece." The younger bikers exchanged uncertain glances. Even in their circles, the Richmond case was legendary. A massive operation that had cleaned out most of the East Coast's organized crime infrastructure. Ghost himself looked shaken, his street instincts finally catching up with what his ego hadn't wanted to admit. "So here's your last chance," Bob continued, the broom handle moving in small, controlled patterns that kept the bikers at bay. "Walk away now. And we'll limit the charges to vandalism and attempted intimidation. Stay, and I'll add assaulting a federal officer, retired or not. That still carries some serious weight. Your choice, but I'd think carefully about it. Those prison terms I helped arrange in the Richmond case, they're still running." Ghost's face twisted through a range of emotions: rage, uncertainty, and finally a calculated coldness that Bob recognized from years of confronting cornered criminals. "You know what? Maybe you are who you say you are. But here's the thing about reputations, Fed. They work both ways. You really think my crew's the only one watching this school? One call. That's all it takes." Bob's stance remained relaxed but ready, the broom handle moving in small patterns that kept the bikers at a careful distance. "Calling Eric Shadow Matthews, I assume. Regional boss, runs operations from the old warehouse district? Interesting choice considering what the Bureau knows about his connection to the missing weapons shipment last month." The shock that rippled through the group told Bob his intelligence was still good. 3 years of retirement hadn't dulled his network of contacts, or his habit of keeping tabs on potential threats in his territory. "You don't know what you're talking about," Ghost snarled. but his voice carried a new edge of uncertainty. Shadow's clean. Police have nothing on him. Police? No, Bob agreed, adjusting his position so the sun remained in his opponent's eyes. But the FBI's Organized Crime Division? That's a different story. Tell me, Ghost, did Shadow mention why he really pushed your chapter to expand into this county? Why he's suddenly so interested in establishing protection contracts with local schools? Through his radio, Kevin's voice came urgent but controlled. Mr. Anderson, police are 4 minutes out, but we've got more bikes approaching from the west entrance. At least 8, maybe more. Right on schedule, Bob commented quietly, though his mind was already calculating new angles, revised tactics. Ghost here couldn't help but make that call, could he? Even though it's exactly what I was waiting for. Brick, still nursing his wrist from their earlier encounter, spoke up. What's that supposed to mean, old man? It means, Bob replied, his voice carrying decades of experience, that your boss Shadow has gotten sloppy. 3 years ago, he would have noticed a retired federal agent setting up shop in his expansion territory. Would have asked himself why someone with my background chose this specific school, this specific county. The sound of approaching motorcycles grew louder, but Bob's calm demeanor only seemed to increase. You want to know the real reason I picked this job, this school? Because 15 years ago, I worked a case involving weapons disappearing from military transports. The trail led to a network of safe houses, all connected to educational facilities, places where no one would think to look too closely. Ghost's face showed a flash of recognition that he couldn't quite hide. Bob noticed and pressed his advantage. Plus, they had an established automotive program with community connections. Perfect cover for what he was planning. Through the radio, Kevin continued coordinating with other locations. Mr. Anderson, Harrison security teams are reporting similar setups at every targeted school. Auto shop programs, donated equipment, modified storage areas. The pattern's consistent across the board. Because Shadow got overconfident, Bob explained, pointing to specific evidence photos. Started using the same methods at every location, thinking his success here meant the model was foolproof. Never considered that each school might have its own protection detail in place. Principal Watson, listening intently, spoke up. The maintenance contracts, the security upgrades, the regular inspections, everything was designed to maintain surveillance? Not everything, Bob corrected. The actual maintenance work, the daily operations, that was all real. Had to be, to maintain our cover. But it gave us access. Let us document their activities without raising suspicion. Detective Cooper's phone buzzed with another update. FBI teams just found something interesting in Shadow's personal files. Looks like he had plans for expanding beyond schools, community centers, youth programs, anywhere he could establish legitimate-looking educational initiatives. Making it harder to spot the illegal operations hidden behind them, Bob nodded. Classic criminal evolution, using legitimate businesses and community programs as cover for illegal activities. But he made one crucial mistake. Getting personally involved, the FBI agent finished, understanding dawning. Instead of using intermediaries like before, he started handling things directly. Through the security office window, they could see Kevin coordinating the ongoing evidence collection, his role as a trained operative now clear in his precise movements and professional demeanor. Teams are finding more weapons caches, Mr. Anderson. Multiple storage locations, all using the same concealment methods. The auto shop donations, James added, still processing his unwitting role in the operation. The special tools, the diagnostic equipment, it was all designed to support their weapons modification work? Partly, Bob confirmed, but also to establish legitimacy. Real equipment, real training programs, real job opportunities, made it harder for anyone to question their presence or motives. Principal Watson studied the evidence photos. And all this time, while they thought they were building their network. We were documenting everything, Bob finished. Every meeting, every delivery, every modification. 3 years of evidence gathering, building an airtight case that would expose not just the local operation, but the entire network. Detective Cooper pulled up new surveillance footage. The other schools in their network, were they all protected like Lincoln Central? Different covers, same principle, Bob explained. Maintenance workers, security guards, support staff, positions that let us observe without drawing attention. Shadow thought he was being clever, using maintenance contracts for cover. Never occurred to him that we might use the same strategy. Through the radio, Kevin reported more findings. Mr. Anderson, teams are discovering financial records. Looks like Shadow was laundering money through the educational programs, using equipment purchases to hide weapons transactions. Classic misdirection, Bob nodded. Hide illegal operations behind legitimate business activities. Schools were perfect for that. Regular equipment needs, ongoing maintenance requirements, constant flow of supplies and materials. The FBI agent reviewed another file. The van incident this morning, you knew they would eventually target you personally? Counted on it, Bob admitted. People like Ghost. They can't resist what they see as an easy target. Gave us the probable cause we needed to move on the weapons cache. Though, he glanced at his damaged vehicle. I didn't expect them to be quite so enthusiastic about the vandalism. Principal Watson looked around at the gathered evidence. So what happens now? With the schools, the automotive programs? We rebuild, Bob said firmly. Legitimate programs, real educational opportunities, actual community support. Because that's what these places should be. Centers of learning, not covers for criminal enterprises. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the office windows. Outside, students moved between classes, largely unaware of the operation that had protected them for 3 years. And that, Bob thought, was exactly how it should be. The best security was the kind that remained invisible until needed, maintained by people who understood that sometimes the most important victories were the ones that looked like nothing had happened at all. And, sir, that thing you told me when I first started here about always being ready for anything, I think I understand now. Bob allowed himself a small smile as he watched the bikers being led away. Sometimes the best lessons came from unexpected teachers, even if they happened to be carrying broom handles instead of badges. Principal Helen Watson strode across the parking lot, her heels clicking against the asphalt with determined purpose. Her eyes took in the scene, tactical teams securing prisoners, FBI evidence units documenting the weapons cache, and in the center of it all, her head janitor calmly leaning on his broom as if this was just another morning at Lincoln Central High. Mr. Anderson, she called out, her voice carrying a mix of concern and newfound understanding. When you first applied for this position, I thought your references were almost too perfect. A decorated federal agent choosing to work as a school janitor? It seemed unusual. That was the point, Bob replied, watching as Ghost was led past in handcuffs. The best covers are the ones that make people question them initially, then dismiss their doubts because the situation seems too unlikely to be fake. Detective Cooper returned from coordinating with the evidence teams, his notebook open. Mr. Anderson, we're going to need your official statement. The weapons we found in the auto shop storage. This is bigger than even we anticipated. Military-grade hardware, automatic weapons, even components for specialized equipment. Shadow wasn't just running guns. He was supplying professional mercenaries. I know, Bob nodded, finally setting his broom aside. That's why we had to let the operation run this long. Had to trace the entire network, document all the connections. The school program was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Through his radio, Kevin continued providing updates as more evidence came to light. They're finding documentation in the auto shop office, Mr. Anderson. Shipping manifests, contact lists, financial records. Shadow kept track of everything. Criminals like Shadow always do, Bob explained to Principal Watson's questioning look. They think detailed records protect them, proof of transactions, leverage over partners. Instead, they give us everything we need to dismantle their entire organization. The second-in-command, Delaney, still awaiting processing, spoke up from his secured position. The other schools in the county, the ones Shadow was pushing us to approach. All under surveillance, Bob confirmed. Each one with its own undercover team posing as maintenance staff. You really think I was the only retired agent who chose to keep working? There's a whole network of us, watching, waiting, protecting places like this. Principal Watson's face showed dawning comprehension. The maintenance contract reviews last year, when you insisted on handling them personally, had to make sure our documentation teams had access to all the right locations, Bob explained. Shadow's operation spread across multiple schools, multiple districts. We needed eyes everywhere. Detective Cooper whistled softly as he reviewed the preliminary evidence reports. Military hardware, international connections, corrupt officials. This is going to shake things up all the way to the state level. Your 3 years of work just exposed one of the largest weapons trafficking operations we've seen. Bob watched as more police units arrived, their lights reflecting off his damaged van. Started with a simple observation, Shadow's interest in school auto shop programs. Same pattern he used 15 years ago, just on a larger scale. He thought enough time had passed that no one would make the connection. But you did, Principal Watson said. You recognized the pattern and set up this entire operation. Had help, Bob admitted, nodding toward Kevin in the security office. Lot of good people working behind the scenes. Some retired like me, some active duty, all committed to keeping places like Lincoln Central safe. Through the morning air came the distant sound of news helicopters approaching. Bob's expression turned thoughtful as he watched more evidence being cataloged. You know what the hardest part was? Not the undercover work, not the evidence gathering. It was watching them target schools, knowing we had to let some things play out to expose the bigger operation. Detective Cooper nodded sympathetically. The long game. Sometimes you have to let smaller crimes happen to prevent bigger ones. That's why the van was perfect, Bob said, running his hand along the new dents and scratches. Knew someone like Ghost couldn't resist an easy target. Gave us the probable cause we needed to move on the weapons cache. Sarah would have appreciated the irony, the van she helped restore becoming the key to taking down a weapons ring. Principal Watson looked at her watch, then at the growing media presence. Students will be arriving soon. Should we cancel classes? No, Bob said firmly. That's exactly what we don't want. Schools should be safe places, normal places. By this afternoon, the tactical teams will be gone, the evidence collected, the news vans moved on, but the message will remain. Some places are protected, whether the protectors are visible or not. Kevin's voice came through the radio one final time. Mr. Anderson, FBI teams have finished securing the auto shop. They found something else. Looks like plans for expanding the operation to other states. Shadow was building something bigger than we thought. He was, Bob agreed, watching the last of the bikers being led away. But that's tomorrow's problem. Today, we've shut down one operation, protected one school, sent one message to anyone who thinks places like this are easy targets. The morning sun climbed higher, its light catching the crystal hummingbird ornament that had somehow survived the van's vandalism. Bob picked it up carefully, remembering Sarah's smile when she'd first hung it from the rearview mirror. Sometimes, he said quietly, the best way to honor a memory is to keep doing what you've always done. Protecting people who can't protect themselves. As the last of the tactical teams secured the area, Detective Cooper's phone buzzed with an urgent update. His expression shifted from satisfaction to concern as he read the message. Mr. Anderson, we might have a bigger situation developing. Shadow's international contacts. They're not happy about losing their supply line. Bob's stance subtly changed. Decades of experience recognizing the shift from one phase of an operation to another. They're mobilizing their local assets? Multiple reports of movement in the warehouse district. Looks like Shadow had a contingency plan. Armed groups converging on several locations across the county, including... Cooper hesitated, looking at Principal Watson. Including schools, Bob finished grimly. Because they think that's where we're vulnerable. Kevin, status report on the other surveillance teams? Through the radio came the steady voice of the young security guard, now fully embracing his role in the larger operation. All teams reporting in. Harrison security personnel are in position at every targeted location. FBI response units deploying county-wide. But Mr. Anderson, they're moving faster than we anticipated. Principal Watson's face showed the calm determination of an educator used to handling crisis situations. We need to implement emergency protocols. Get the students to safety before... No, Bob interrupted, his voice carrying quiet authority. That's exactly what they want, to create panic, disrupt normal operations, show that they can still exercise control. We maintain routine, just with enhanced security measures. Detective Cooper looked skeptical. You want to keep the school open with armed groups potentially en route? Trust me, Bob said, moving to check his van's hidden compartment. Shadow's international friends are about to learn the same lesson he did. Underestimating school security was their first mistake. From the compartment, he retrieved a small laptop, its screen already displaying a map of the county with multiple blinking indicators. Remember what I said about retired agents who chose to keep working? This is why. Every school in Shadow's network has people like me in place, watching, waiting, protected by our apparent insignificance. Through the security office windows, they could see Kevin coordinating with other locations, his training now clearly evident in his precise communications. Harrison security teams reporting ready status, Mr. Anderson. Surveillance networks active at all locations. The maintenance company, Principal Watson realized. It's not just a cover for your operation. It's a network of former federal agents, military personnel, and law enforcement professionals, Bob confirmed, typing rapidly on the laptop. All choosing to protect schools and communities in their retirement. Shadow thought he was clever, using maintenance contracts for cover. He never considered we might have the same idea. Detective Cooper's phone buzzed again. First confrontation reported at East River High. Armed group tried to breach the perimeter and was stopped by the groundskeeping staff? Former Marine Force Recon, Bob said with a slight smile. It turns out Jerry's leaf blower makes an excellent distraction device. His team has the situation contained. Through the radio came more updates, similar scenes playing out across the county. At each location, what appeared to be ordinary maintenance and security personnel revealed themselves to be highly trained professionals, systematically neutralizing threats and protecting their assigned facilities. 3 years of preparation, Bob explained, monitoring the situation through his laptop. While Shadow was building his weapons distribution network, we were building something else. A protective network of experienced operators, all hiding in plain sight. Every school he targeted, we targeted first. Principal Watson watched in amazement as more reports came in of threats being neutralized by seemingly ordinary school staff. How many of our employees are part of this? Enough, Bob replied cryptically. The best security is the kind no one notices until it's needed. That's why we choose these roles. Janitors, maintenance workers, security guards. The people others look past, never considering that we might be watching, waiting, protecting. Detective Cooper's radio crackled with tactical updates. They're pulling back county-wide. Shadow's international contacts. They're standing down. Of course they are. Bob nodded, closing his laptop. They just realized their entire operation was compromised from the start. Every school they tried to use as a distribution point, every facility they thought was under their control, all monitored by people they never thought to suspect. Through the morning air came the sound of students beginning to arrive, their normal chatter and laughter a stark contrast to the tension of earlier events. Bob picked up his broom again, resuming his regular pattern of sweeping. Just like that, Principal Watson asked, watching him return to his routine. Back to normal? This is normal, Bob replied, his movements once again those of a simple janitor. The best victories are the ones that look like nothing happened at all. Students stay safe, schools stay open, and the only sign anything changed is maybe a few extra dents in an old van. Detective Cooper shook his head in amazement. A whole network of retired agents hiding in plain sight protecting schools across the county. Shadow never stood a chance, did he? No, Bob agreed, watching the first students walk past, completely unaware of how close danger had come, or how well protected they truly were. Because he made the same mistake they all make. He saw the uniform, the work boots, the cleaning supplies, and thought he knew everything he needed to know. Never asked himself why someone would choose this job, this place, this particular time to start a new career. Mr. Anderson, a voice called out across the parking lot. Bob turned to see James Mitchell, the auto shop teacher, hurrying toward them. His face showed the complex mix of emotions that came with realizing someone you worked with daily had been living a complete other life. 3 years, James said, shaking his head. 3 years of sharing coffee in the break room, discussing engine repairs, and all this time. He gestured at the tactical teams, still processing evidence from his shop. About that, Bob replied, his voice carrying a hint of apology. Those mechanical problems I kept bringing you, the ones that needed after-hours diagnostic work, we were actually documenting Shadow's people moving through the service entrance. Detective Cooper flipped through his notes. Mr. Mitchell, we're going to need your help cataloging exactly what equipment they brought in under the guise of teaching materials. According to our preliminary investigation, they were using the auto shop program to train their people in vehicle modifications, specifically, creating hidden compartments for weapons transport. James ran a hand through his hair, processing this new information. The special tools they donated, the custom diagnostic equipment. I thought they were just being supportive of technical education. Even recommended their program to other schools in the district. Which is exactly what they wanted, Bob explained. Shadow's operation needed to look legitimate on the surface, real companies, real educational programs, real community involvement. Made it harder to spot the illegal activities happening behind the scenes. Through the radio, Kevin's voice provided another update. Mr. Anderson, FBI teams at North High just found another weapons cache. Same setup. Hidden compartments in the auto shop storage area. They're saying the serial numbers match Shadow's inventory lists. The whole county, James breathed, realization dawning. They were using the entire school system as a distribution network. Principal Watson, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. But you knew. From the moment you took this job, you knew what they were planning. That's why you insisted on personally inspecting all the equipment donations, why you spent so much time documenting everything that came through the automotive program. Bob nodded, leaning on his broom. Shadow's operation 15 years ago used a similar method, hiding weapons in school automotive programs. But back then, he was smarter about it. Used intermediaries, kept his distance, made it harder to prove connections. This time, he shook his head. Success made him careless. Started handling things personally, getting directly involved with the schools. Detective Cooper's phone buzzed again. Update from the warehouse team. They found Shadow's complete records, every school in their network, every modified vehicle, every weapons shipment. He documented everything. Because he thought he was untouchable, Bob explained. 3 years of successful operations, expanding across the county. No one seeming to notice or care. Why wouldn't he feel confident? Through the security office window, they could see Kevin coordinating with other locations, his role now clearly more than just a school security guard. Harrison security teams reporting similar findings at multiple schools. Mr. Anderson. The patterns identical everywhere. Auto shop programs, donated equipment, hidden storage areas. James looked around his shop, seeing it with new eyes. The late-night maintenance sessions, the special projects they wanted students to work on. We were training their people without even knowing it. Not your fault, Bob assured him. They were careful about that part. Everything looked legitimate on the surface. Real companies, real educational goals, real job opportunities for students. The weapons were just one part of a larger operation. Principal Watson watched as more evidence teams arrived, their vehicles filling the parking lot. The other maintenance staff, the security personnel at other schools, are they all? Like me? Bob smiled slightly. Not all, but enough. Shadow thought he was being clever, using maintenance contracts for cover. Never occurred to him that someone else might have the same idea, that every school he targeted might already be protected by people who knew exactly what to look for. Detective Cooper reviewed another update on his phone. FBI teams are finding more documentation. Looks like Shadow was planning to expand the operation. More schools, more automotive programs, more weapons storage facilities disguised as educational equipment. But you stopped it, James said, still processing everything. 3 years of working here, pretending to be just another janitor, building your case piece by piece. Not just me, Bob corrected. Every school in their network had people watching, waiting, gathering evidence. The maintenance staff who seemed invisible, the security guards no one paid attention to, all part of a larger operation to protect these schools. Through the radio came Kevin's voice again. Mr. Anderson, FBI command wants to know if you're ready to brief the task force. They're saying this could be the largest weapons trafficking case in state history. Bob straightened up, his posture subtly shifting from janitor to federal agent. Tell them I'll be there shortly, but first. He looked at his vandalized van, at the school he'd protected for 3 years, at the colleagues who were seeing him in a completely new light. First, I need to finish my morning rounds, because that's what we do. Maintain our cover, protect our posts, keep watching even after the immediate threat is gone. Principal Watson smiled, understanding dawning in her eyes. Because there's always another Shadow, another operation, another threat to protect against. Exactly. Bob nodded, resuming his sweeping pattern. The job's never really done. Not as long as there are schools to protect and people who think they can use them for their own purposes. Inside the main office, now transformed into a temporary command center, Bob stood before a gathering of FBI agents, local law enforcement, and school administrators. The evidence from Shadow's operation covered every available surface. Photos, documents, weapons, inventory lists, and detailed maps of school facilities across the county. 3 years ago, Bob began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who dedicated his life to this work. We received intelligence that Shadow Matthews was rebuilding his weapons trafficking operation. Just like before, he was targeting schools, particularly their automotive programs. But this time, he was thinking bigger, not just local distribution, but an entire network spanning multiple districts. Detective Cooper pulled up surveillance photos on the main screen. The automotive program was just the beginning. They were using school facilities as storage points, training centers, and distribution hubs. Each location carefully chosen, each operation disguised as legitimate educational support. What made you choose Lincoln Central as your base of operations? An FBI agent asked, reviewing the case files. Bob's eyes drifted to the window where his damaged van still sat in its usual spot. Strategic location, central to Shadow's planned expansion route. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the command center as a new wave of information began flooding in. Detective Cooper's phone buzzed continuously with updates from field teams across the county, each report revealing another layer of Shadow's operation. Mr. Anderson, Cooper called out, reviewing the latest data. We've got something interesting from the warehouse district. Looks like Shadow wasn't just storing weapons. They found evidence of an international connection. Bank transfers, shipping manifests, communications with overseas contacts. Bob moved to examine the new evidence, his expression thoughtful. Not surprising. An operation this size needed serious backing. The question is, who was really pulling the strings? Through the radio, Kevin's voice carried urgency. "Sir, Harrison security teams are reporting unusual activity at multiple schools. Looks like Shadow's international partners are trying to salvage what they can of the operation." "Expected that," Bob nodded, pulling up surveillance feeds on the main screen. "They've got too much invested to just walk away. Principal Watson, I think we might need to implement those additional security protocols we discussed." Helen Watson's eyes narrowed with understanding. "The emergency response drills we've been running? The ones you insisted on modifying?" "Weren't just about student safety," Bob confirmed. "We were preparing for this possibility. Shadow's partners trying to maintain control of their distribution network, even with him in custody." Detective Cooper studied the surveillance feeds. "They're moving fast, coordinated attacks on multiple locations, but something's off about their pattern." "Because they're walking into another trap," Bob explained, a slight smile playing at his corners of his mouth. "Every school they're targeting already has teams in place. We didn't just prepare for Shadow, we prepared for whoever was backing him." Through the windows, they could see more FBI vehicles arriving, their lights reflecting off the school's walls. James Mitchell, still processing his role in the larger picture, spoke up. "The auto shop program modifications, the special security protocols. It was all designed for this moment." 3 years of preparation, Bob confirmed, typing commands into the surveillance system. "Shadow's operation gave us cover to implement security measures across the entire school district. His partners think they're moving to secure their assets. But they're actually exposing themselves," the FBI agent finished, understanding dawning. "Every move they make reveals another connection, another piece of their network." Kevin's voice came through the radio again. "Mr. Anderson, we are tracking multiple vehicles approaching targeted schools. High-end SUVs, diplomatic plates. Looks like the real players are finally showing themselves." "Perfect," Bob replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a plan coming together. "Tell all teams to maintain surveillance but do not engage. Let them walk right into it." Principal Watson watched the surveillance feeds with growing amazement. All this time, while Shadow thought he was building his weapon distribution network, we were building something else, Bob finished. A surveillance network that could identify and track not just local criminals, but their international connections. The schools weren't just Shadow's cover. They became our tool for exposing everyone involved. Detective Cooper's phone buzzed with another update. FBI teams are finding more. Offshore accounts, shell companies, political connections. This goes higher than anyone suspected. Not higher than we suspected, Bob corrected, pulling up additional files on his laptop. 3 years gives you time to follow every lead, document every connection. Shadow's partners thought they were invisible, operating through proxies and cutouts, but they forgot one thing. The maintenance contracts, James realized. Your people had access to everything. Through the command center windows, they could see more tactical teams arriving, positioning themselves with practiced precision. Bob watched their deployment with approval. Shadow's biggest mistake wasn't getting sloppy with his operation. It was assuming he was the only one who could use legitimate businesses as cover. Principal Watson studied the growing evidence wall. The other schools in their network, were they all part of your operation from the beginning? Had to be, Bob explained, monitoring multiple surveillance feeds. Couldn't risk them establishing any secure locations. Every school they targeted, we targeted first. Maintenance contracts, security upgrades, staff positions, all staffed by our people. Kevin's voice crackled through the radio. Sir, we're getting reports of similar operations being exposed in other states. Looks like Shadow's partners had networks everywhere. Not anymore, Bob replied grimly. 3 years of evidence gathering, all leading to this moment. They thought taking down Shadow was our endgame. Actually, it was just the beginning. Detective Cooper reviewed another update. International law enforcement is moving on identified targets. Interpol, FBI, Multiple agencies coordinating raids across 3 continents. Because now we have proof, Bob nodded, watching the operation unfold across multiple screens. Not just of weapons trafficking, but of everyone involved, from street-level gangs to international arms dealers. Shadow's operation didn't just give us cover to protect these schools. It let you expose an entire global network, the FBI agent finished, shaking his head in amazement, using their own methods against them. Through the afternoon light, they could see students continuing their normal routines, unaware of the international operation unfolding around them. And that, Bob thought, was the real victory, not just stopping criminals, but ensuring that places of learning remained exactly that, protected by people who understood that sometimes the best way to fight darkness was to work in the shadows yourself. As evening approached, the command center buzzed with new developments. FBI teams were coordinating with international law enforcement, tracking the ripple effects of Shadow's exposed operation across multiple countries. Bob stood at the central monitoring station, watching as years of careful planning culminated in synchronized raids worldwide. "Mr. Anderson," Kevin's voice came through the radio. "We're getting reports of unusual financial activity. Looks like Shadow's partners are trying to move their assets before they can be frozen." "Too late," Bob replied, pulling up data streams on his laptop. "Every transaction they make just gives us more evidence. Detective Cooper, can you confirm the status of those offshore accounts we identified?" Cooper checked his latest updates. "Already frozen. Treasury Department moved as soon as we confirmed the weapons trafficking connection. They're finding links to other criminal enterprises, money laundering, drug trafficking, even terrorist financing." Through the command center windows, they could see more federal vehicles arriving, these carrying cybercrime specialists and financial forensics teams. Principal Watson watched their deployment with growing understanding. "The school's computer network upgrades last year," she said. "The new servers, the enhanced security protocols. You weren't just protecting student data, were you?" "Part of it was legitimate security," Bob explained, monitoring multiple screens. "But we also needed the infrastructure to track their digital operations. Shadow's partners thought they were being clever, using school networks to mask their communications." James Mitchell shook his head in amazement. "The automotive program's computer systems, the diagnostic equipment they donated, it was all connected to their network?" "Gave them a way to coordinate shipments, track inventory, maintain secure communications," Bob confirmed. "But it also gave us access to everything they were doing. 3 years of digital breadcrumbs, all leading back to the real players behind the operation." Kevin's voice crackled through again. "Sir, we're detecting attempts to access the school's servers remotely, multiple sources highly sophisticated." "Let them try," Bob smiled slightly. "Every attempt just reveals another connection. Detective Cooper, make sure the cyber team is recording everything. We're about to get a very interesting map of their entire network." Through the windows, they could see the sun setting over Lincoln Central High, casting long shadows across the parking lot where everything had started that morning. Bob's damaged van still sat in its usual spot, its dents and scratches now evidence in an international investigation. "The van incident," Principal Watson mused. "Even that played into your larger plan?" "Needed a catalyst," Bob explained. "Something to make them move before they were ready. Ghost's crew taking the bait this morning gave us the probable cause we needed to move on everything simultaneously." Detective Cooper's phone buzzed with another update. "Interpol just reported successful raids in 6 countries. They're finding the same pattern everywhere. Weapons caches hidden in educational facilities, all connected to Shadow's partners." "Because they got greedy," Bob nodded. "Success here made them think they could replicate the model globally. Never occurred to them that each new location just gave us more evidence, more connections to track." Through the radio, Kevin reported more developments. FBI cyber team says they're mapping the entire communication network. Every server they try to access, every system they attempt to scrub, it's all being documented in real time. 3 years, James said quietly. 3 years of watching them build this operation, letting them think they were untouchable. Had to be thorough, Bob replied, studying the incoming data. Wasn't enough to just stop the weapons trafficking. Had to expose everyone involved, from street-level gangs to international financiers. Principal Watson watched as more evidence teams arrived. The other schools in their network? Were they all part of this larger operation? Each one served a specific purpose, Bob explained. Some were storage points, others distribution hubs. But together they gave us a complete picture of how the organization functioned. Shadow thought he was building something unstoppable. Instead, he helped us create the perfect trap. Detective Cooper reviewed another report. Treasury departments finding connections to legitimate businesses, political figures, even some law enforcement officials. This is going to shake things up at every level. That's the point, Bob said firmly. Had to expose the entire system, not just the obvious criminals. Show how deep the corruption really went. Through the evening air came the sound of more helicopters. News teams now, drawn by whispers of an international operation centered on a quiet suburban high school. Bob watched their arrival with mild amusement. Tomorrow's headlines are going to be interesting, he commented. International weapons ring exposed by school janitor, though they'll probably leave out the part about 3 years of careful planning, dozens of undercover operatives, and a network of protected schools that turned their own methods against them. As night fell over Lincoln Central High, the parking lot lights illuminated a scene far different from the quiet morning that had started it all. Federal agents coordinated with international law enforcement. Evidence teams processed mountains of data, and in the center of it all, a simple janitor's van stood as testament to how appearances could be deceiving. "You know what the real victory is?" Bob said quietly, watching students at evening activities continuing their normal routines. Not just stopping criminals, but proving that places like this can be protected. That sometimes the best defense is the one nobody sees coming. Night had fully settled over Lincoln Central High School, but the command center remained a hub of intense activity. Screens displayed real-time updates from operations across the globe, each report revealing another layer of Shadow's exposed network. "Mr. Anderson," Detective Cooper called out, reviewing the latest intelligence. "We've got confirmation from European authorities. They've seized multiple weapons caches, all matching the pattern we found here. Same school-based storage systems, same auto shop covers, same equipment modifications." Bob nodded, studying the incoming data. Shadow's partners thought they'd found the perfect model. Use legitimate educational programs as cover, hide in plain sight. Never considered we might use the same strategy against them. Through the radio, Kevin's voice carried a mix of excitement and professionalism. "Sir, Harrison security teams are reporting successful containment at all targeted locations. Every attempt to salvage their operation has been documented and traced." "The automotive programs," James Mitchell spoke up, still processing the day's revelations. "Were they all compromised, all being used for weapons modifications?" "Not all," Bob explained, pulling up detailed reports. "Some were completely legitimate. Shadow's people targeted specific schools, ones with established programs and community connections. Made it easier to hide their real activities behind genuine educational work." Principal Watson watched the evidence teams processing mountains of documentation. The maintenance contracts, the security upgrades, the staff positions. "How many schools were actually protected by your people?" "Everyone they targeted," Bob confirmed. "Sometimes months before they made their move. We knew their pattern, knew where they'd try to expand. Let us put our people in place, waiting, watching, gathering evidence." Detective Cooper's phone buzzed with another update. FBI Financial Crimes Unit just reported in. They're finding connections to major banking institutions, investment firms, even government contractors. This goes deeper than anyone imagined. "Not deeper than we expected," Bob corrected, bringing up files on his laptop. 3 years gives you time to follow every trail, document every connection. Shadow's operation wasn't just about weapons, it was about building infrastructure, establishing networks, creating systems that could hide multiple criminal enterprises. Through the command center windows, they could see more federal vehicles arriving, these carrying specialized equipment for digital forensics. Kevin's voice came through again. Cyber team reports they've mapped most of their communication networks. Every server, every digital footprint, all leading back to their international partners. Because they got comfortable, Bob explained, watching the operation unfold across multiple screens. Success made them careless. Started using the same methods everywhere, thinking their model was foolproof. Never occurred to them that each new location just gave us more evidence to collect. Principal Watson studied the surveillance feeds, showing similar operations being exposed worldwide. The other maintenance companies, the security firms, were they all like Harrison Security Services? Different names, same purpose, Bob nodded. Network of former agents, law enforcement, military personnel, all choosing to protect schools in their retirement. Shadow thought he was being clever, using maintenance contracts for cover. Never considered someone else might have the same idea. James shook his head in amazement. The equipment donations, the special tools, the training programs, everything had a dual purpose. Had to maintain legitimacy, Bob explained. Real equipment, real training, real opportunities for students. Made it harder to spot the illegal activities happening alongside them, but it also gave us perfect cover to document everything they were doing. Detective Cooper reviewed another report. International Task Force is moving on identified targets, banking records, shipping manifests, communication logs. They're finding evidence of operations going back decades. Shadow just made it easier to expose, Bob confirmed. His operation gave us access to their entire network. Every connection, every partner, every hidden asset. All documented over 3 years of patient observation. Through the night air came the distant sound of more helicopters. Law enforcement now, supporting operations across the county. Kevin's radio updates continued. Treasury Department reports asset seizures in multiple countries. They're dismantling the entire financial network. The real victory, Bob said quietly, watching the coordinated response, isn't just stopping weapons trafficking, it's exposing how these organizations operate, how they hide behind legitimate businesses and institutions, making it harder for anyone to use the same methods again. Principal Watson looked out at the school grounds, now illuminated by floodlights and emergency vehicles. Tomorrow, when students return, what do we tell them about all this? The truth, Bob replied firmly. That their school was protected, that people were watching out for them, that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that look like nothing happened at all. Through the command center, evidence teams continued processing the massive amount of data recovered from Shadow's operation. Each document, each digital file, each piece of evidence telling part of a story that had taken 3 years to fully expose. And at the center of it all, a simple janitor's van stood as testament to the power of patience, preparation, and the understanding that sometimes the best way to fight darkness was to work in the shadows yourself. As midnight approached, Bob stood in the quiet of the auto shop, surrounded by the remnants of Shadow's exposed operation. Evidence teams had finished processing the area, leaving behind marked locations and inventory tags where weapons had been concealed beneath seemingly innocent equipment. Hard to believe, James Mitchell said, joining him in the darkened shop. 3 years of teaching students right here, never knowing what was really happening behind the scenes. That's what made it perfect cover, Bob replied, running his hand along a modified tool cabinet that had concealed weapons components. Real education happening alongside their illegal operations made it almost impossible for anyone to spot unless they knew exactly what to look for. Through the radio, Kevin's voice broke the night's silence. Mr. Anderson, final reports coming in from international operations. They've seized over $500 million in assets, exposed connections to 3 terrorist organizations, and identified corrupt officials in 12 countries. Detective Cooper entered the shop, his face showing the exhaustion of a long day, but also satisfaction. Treasury Department just confirmed. They've frozen every account we identified. Shadow's entire network, all their legitimate businesses, everything they built over decades, it's all being dismantled. Because they got greedy, Bob explained, examining the sophisticated diagnostic equipment that had doubled as weapons testing stations. Success here made them think they could expand globally. Each new location, each new school program, just gave us more evidence to collect. Principal Watson joined them, her heels echoing in the empty shop. The school board called an emergency meeting for tomorrow. They want to know how many other educational facilities might be compromised. We can give them a complete list, Bob assured her. Every school Shadow targeted, every program they tried to infiltrate. But more importantly, we can show them how to prevent it from happening again. Through the windows, they could see FBI teams still processing data in the command center. Kevin's updates continued. Sir, Harrison security teams report all sensitive materials have been removed from targeted schools. Cleanup operations are underway. The automotive program, James said quietly. Can it be saved? After everything that happened here? It has to be, Bob replied firmly. That's the real victory, not just stopping criminals, but reclaiming these spaces for their intended purpose. Real education, real opportunities, real community support. Detective Cooper checked another update on his phone. Interpol just reported they're finding similar operations in other countries. Schools, technical programs, all being used as cover for weapons trafficking. But now they know what to look for, Bob nodded. 3 years of evidence gathering didn't just expose Shadow's network. It created a blueprint for identifying and stopping similar operations worldwide. Principal Watson studied the modified equipment around them. The other maintenance companies, the security firms protecting schools, will they continue their work? They have to, Bob confirmed, because there will always be people like Shadow looking for vulnerable institutions to exploit. The best defense is the one they never see coming, hiding in plain sight, watching, waiting, protecting. Through the radio, Kevin reported more developments. FBI cyber team has finished mapping their entire communication network. Every server, every digital footprint, all documented and preserved for prosecution. The students, James spoke up. The ones who worked in this shop learned on this equipment. What do we tell them? We tell them the truth, Bob said, moving toward the shop entrance. That their education was real, their skills are valuable, and that sometimes the best way to fight darkness is to bring everything into the light. Detective Cooper's phone buzzed one final time for the night. Last update from the task force. They're calling this the largest weapons trafficking bust in history. Multiple agencies, multiple countries, all coordinating to take down an entire criminal network. All because they underestimated a school janitor. Principal Watson smiled slightly. Never thought to look closely at the maintenance staff, the security personnel, the people they considered beneath their notice. Bob paused at the shop door, looking back at the space that had played such a crucial role in exposing Shadow's operation. That's always been their weakness, assuming that power only looks one way, that threat only comes from obvious sources. They never consider that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one they don't even see as an opponent. Through the night air came the sound of the last federal vehicles departing, their lights painting the school buildings in fading red and blue. Kevin's final radio update of the night carried a note of pride. All sectors secure, Mr. Anderson. Harrison security teams resuming normal operations at all locations. Normal operations, James repeated thoughtfully. After today, what does that even mean? It means we keep working, Bob replied, reaching for his broom. Keep watching, keep protecting, keep maintaining our cover. Because somewhere out there, someone else is looking at schools like this and seeing opportunity for exploitation. Our job is to be here when they come, waiting in the shadows they think are empty. As midnight struck, Lincoln Central High School stood quiet under the stars. To anyone passing by, it looked like any other educational institution, peaceful, ordinary, unremarkable, And that, Bob thought as he began his final rounds of the night, was exactly how it should be. The best victories were the ones that remained invisible, protected by people who understood that sometimes the most important battles were won not with weapons or force, but with patience, vigilance, and the willingness to become what others overlooked. Dawn was breaking over Lincoln Central High School as Bob Anderson made his final sweep of the parking lot. The evidence teams had departed, the command center had been dismantled, and all traces of the previous day's operation had been carefully erased. Only his damaged van remained as testament to how everything had started. "Hard to believe it's really over," Kevin said, joining him by the van. The young security guard had shed his operational demeanor, once again appearing as just another school employee. 3 years of preparation, all coming down to a single day. "Not over," Bob corrected, running his hand along the van's new dents and scratches. School's technical programs, community outreach. Who would look too closely at something that seemed to be helping students? Through the morning air came the sound of buses approaching. Principal Watson emerged from the building, watching the first students arrive. "The school board accepted our recommendations. Every facility in Shadow's network will be getting security upgrades, enhanced monitoring systems." "And maintenance contracts?" Bob asked, though his slight smile suggested he already knew the answer. "Harrison Security Services has been approved as the primary contractor for all locations," she confirmed. Apparently their record of service is impeccable. James Mitchell joined them, carrying his usual morning coffee. "Auto shop's been cleared by the FBI. We can resume normal classes today. Though," he added with a thoughtful look, "I suppose I'll be checking equipment donations more carefully from now on." "That's the real lesson in all that," Bob nodded, watching more students arrive. Not just stopping one criminal operation, but learning how to prevent the next one, making these spaces harder to exploit, harder to infiltrate. Through his radio, Kevin reported the start of normal security operations. "First shift beginning, Mr. Anderson. All systems operating normally, Harrison security teams in place at all locations." "You know what amazes me most?" Detective Cooper said, reviewing his final notes. "Not just the scale of what was exposed, but how it was done. 3 years of patient observation, gathering evidence piece by piece, all while maintaining perfect cover." "Because that's what the job requires," Bob replied, his movements with the broom as precise as ever. "Whether you're an active agent or retired, protecting people means becoming whatever the situation needs. Sometimes that's a federal officer with a badge. Sometimes it's a janitor with a broom." Principal Watson watched as students filled the parking lot, their normal morning routines resuming as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "Will you stay? Now that the operation's complete, now that Shadow's network is exposed?" "Of course," Bob said without hesitation. This was never just about one case, one operation. These schools need protection, need people willing to watch from the shadows, need defenders who understand that sometimes the best security is the kind no one notices. Through the morning light, they could see his van's crystal hummingbird ornament catching the sun's rays. Somehow, it had survived the vandalism, just as Sarah's memory had survived to see justice done. "The other schools," James asked, "the ones in Shadow's network, are they all protected like this? All watched over by people like you?" "More than you'd think," Bob smiled slightly. "Retired agents, former military, law enforcement veterans, all choosing to continue their service in different ways. Because someone has to stand guard, has to maintain the watch, has to be ready when people like Shadow see schools as opportunities for exploitation." Detective Cooper checked his phone one final time. "Last update from the task force. Shadow's international partners are all in custody. Their entire operation, everything they built over decades, completely dismantled in a single day." "Not a single day," Bob corrected, pausing in his sweeping. 3 years of preparation, of patience, of building an airtight case. The takedown might have happened quickly, but the real work was in the waiting, the watching, the gathering of evidence, piece by piece. Principal Watson looked around at the school coming to life around them. And now? What happens now? Now, Bob replied, resuming his careful patterns with the broom. We go back to work. Keep maintaining our cover, keep protecting these spaces, keep watching for the next threat. Because there will always be another shadow, another operation, another attempt to use schools for criminal purposes. The morning sun now fully illuminated Lincoln Central High School, showing it for what it truly was. Not just an educational institution, but a fortress of sorts, protected by guardians who chose to remain invisible, who understood that sometimes the greatest strength lay in being underestimated. And among them moved a simple janitor, his broom creating perfect patterns across the parking lot, his weathered face and stooped shoulders making him invisible to casual observation. Just another maintenance worker, just another person in uniform, just another defender who had learned that sometimes the best way to protect what matters most is to become what others overlook. Because in the end, Bob thought as he watched students hurry to their first classes, that's what really matters, not the dramatic takedowns or the international operations, but the quiet victory of keeping places like this safe, secure, and free to fulfill their true purpose. One day at a time, one sweep of the broom at a time, always watching, always ready, always protecting from the shadows. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.